Both pilots suddenly collapsed mid-flight, leaving the aircraft helpless in the sky, and in that single moment the entire atmosphere inside the cabin changed. What had been a peaceful, ordinary journey transformed into a living nightmare. The lights flickered, the warning alarms began to beep with a sharp, urgent rhythm, and the plane tilted ever so slightly, just enough for every passenger to feel that something was wrong. People exchanged confused looks before fear spread like a fast-moving wave. Mothers gripped their children, strangers held onto their armrests, and every heartbeat seemed to thump louder than the next. The plane gave a sudden jolt, dipping downward long enough for loose bags in the overhead bins to shift. Gasps echoed through the aisles as oxygen masks dangled and the familiar, confident voice of the pilot never came. Usually, during turbulence, the pilot reassured everyone, telling them things were under control. But this time, there was only silence. A terrifying, suffocating silence broken only by the alarming beeps coming from the cockpit door. Inside row 23, by the window, sat an 11-year-old girl named Emily. She had been reading a book, legs tucked under her seat, completely unaware that her life, along with everyone else's, was about to change forever. Emily wasn't like other children her age. She was quiet, observant, and extremely curious. She loved flying and had spent countless hours at home using her father's flight simulator. She used to tell her dad that one day she would fly a real airplane. He always smiled and told her how talented she was, but even in her wildest imagination, Emily never thought she would be the one controlling a plane full of passengers in real life. As the plane continued to dip, Emily felt her stomach twist, not just from fear but from the unnatural angle of the aircraft. She looked around and saw panic rising in the faces of the people around her. A baby began to cry. A middle-aged man pressed the flight attendant call button repeatedly. A woman clasped her hands tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. The flight attendants were rushing back and forth, their forced smiles fading as they exchanged worried glances among themselves. Then came the announcement, an announcement no passenger ever dreams of hearing. A trembling flight attendant picked up the intercom, her voice breaking as she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to know immediately if anyone on board has any flying experience." The pilots are unresponsive. Absolute silence fell. Not a single person raised their hand. Not a single voice spoke. Fear froze the entire cabin. How could an entire flight not have a single person capable of helping? Emily felt her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone around her could hear it. She remembered the hours she spent flying virtual planes, learning how to take off, how to land, how to respond when the simulator threw emergencies at her. Of course, she had never touched a real airplane, but she understood the basics. More than the basics, she had practiced hundreds of times. And right now, despite being just an 11-year-old girl, she knew more about flying than anyone else on that plane. But doubt paralyzed her for a moment. She was just a kid. Would anyone believe her? Would they trust her? Could she really walk up to the front of a massive commercial aircraft and say she could help? What if she made things worse? What if she failed? Then she remembered her father's voice, calm and encouraging, telling her she was capable of anything she set her mind to. She took a deep breath, held onto her trembling hands, and looked at all the frightened faces around her. If she didn't step up, if she didn't try, all these people, mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, could lose their lives. And she couldn't sit still knowing she might be able to help. The aircraft dipped again, more sharply this time, and passengers screamed. A food cart rolled across the aisle, crashing into a seat. That was the moment Emily stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't make a dramatic announcement. She simply walked toward the aisle with determination in her eyes, brushing past knees and armrests until she reached the front where a flight attendant was desperately trying to radio for help. The attendant looked down, confused to see such a young girl standing there. Emily swallowed hard and said, with a steady voice she didn't even know she had, "I can help." The flight attendant blinked. "Sweetheart, this is not a place for children right now. Please go back to." "No," Emily insisted. "I know how to fly. I trained on a flight simulator for years. I know the controls. I know what to do." Her words hung in the air like something impossible, something unbelievable. A child claiming she could fly a commercial aircraft. It sounded absurd. But the plane tilted again, the warning alarms screamed louder, and the flight attendant realized they had no other option. No trained pilot. No co-pilot. No one with even the slightest aviation skills, except this child. "Come with me," the attendant said, voice shaking. Emily stepped into the cockpit, and the moment she crossed the threshold, her breath caught in her throat. The pilots lay slumped in their seats, unconscious, oxygen masks dangling uselessly above them. Lights flashed across the control panel in chaotic patterns, and alarms continued their relentless warning. The sight would have made any adult freeze in horror, but Emily forced herself to focus. She scanned the controls, recognizing many of them from the simulator at home. Her hands shook, but she recalled her father always telling her, "A pilot must stay calm, no matter what." So she inhaled deeply and placed her tiny hands on the yoke. It felt heavier than she expected, cold, real, and terrifying. But she held on. "Contact the tower," she said, surprising the flight attendant. "Tell them a young pilot trainee is taking control." A moment later, the voice of air traffic control crackled through the speaker, confused but ready to help. Emily followed their instructions with intense concentration. Every muscle in her body tensed as she gently pulled back on the yoke to level the aircraft. The plane wobbled like a frightened bird trying to regain balance in a storm, but gradually, very slowly, it stabilized. Passengers felt the change. The sudden chaos began to quiet. People stopped screaming. The crying softened. Mothers hugged their children. Hope slowly crept back into the cabin. But Emily knew this was only the beginning. Getting control was one thing, landing was another challenge entirely. A challenge even experienced pilots fear during emergencies. Yet, as she looked out of the cockpit window at the endless stretch of clouds and sky, she made herself a promise. She would not let these people down. Not now. Not ever. The fate of 186 passengers rested in the hands of an 11-year-old girl who refused to give up. She tightened her grip on the controls, her eyes locked forward, ready to do what no one ever thought she could: bring a falling airplane back to safety. A flight attendant rushed to the intercom, her hands trembling so badly that she nearly dropped the microphone. The alarms from the cockpit blared behind her like a chorus of warning sirens, making it nearly impossible to think clearly. Her voice cracked as she forced the announcement out, trying desperately to sound calm even as panic tightened her chest. "If anyone on board has flying experience, any at all, please come to the front immediately. This is an emergency." The words echoed down the aisle, bouncing off the cabin walls with a kind of haunting weight. Passengers froze. Some looked at each other, silently praying that someone, anyone, would stand up. Others stared into the void, gripping their armrests so tightly their fingers turned white. A father clutched his toddler against his chest, rocking back and forth. A teenager silently cried, trying to hide her face behind her hoodie. A businessman shut his eyes and pressed his forehead to the seat in front of him, whispering broken prayers under his breath. But no one moved. The flight attendant repeated the call, this time her voice cracking under the pressure. "Please, if there is anyone who knows how to fly a plane, please step forward." Nothing. Not a single person stood. Not a single person raised a hand. It was as if the very air inside the cabin had frozen in place, thick and heavy with fear. The realization settled across the passengers like a suffocating blanket: there was no one. No pilot. No co-pilot. No off-duty airman. No retired captain returning home. No one who could bring the aircraft back from disaster. The flight attendant lowered the intercom with shaking fingers. Tears threatened to spill down her cheeks, but she forced herself to maintain a brave face. She looked at her fellow crew members, who were already pale with dread. They all knew what this meant. Without a pilot, without anyone who knew what to do, an airplane was nothing more than a helpless, metal giant drifting through the sky with nearly 200 souls on board. The aircraft jolted again. This one was sharper than before, violent enough to make several passengers scream and clutch their seats. A drinks cart tipped, smashing onto its side and spilling cans, plastic cups, and ice across the aisle. The lights flickered. Oxygen masks swung. A child cried loudly, overwhelmed by fear. Somewhere near the middle of the plane, an 11-year-old girl named Emily felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She wasn't crying like the others. She wasn't screaming or praying or frozen in shock. She was thinking. Hard. Very hard. She remembered the hours she had spent sitting beside her father in their small home office, the glow of the computer screen illuminating their faces as he showed her how to operate a flight simulator. It had started as a game, something fun to do together on weekends. But Emily took it seriously. She learned about controls, engines, altitude, autopilot, landing gear, flaps, communication, everything her father knew, he passed on to her. He used to joke, "One day, kiddo, you're going to fly the real thing." She always laughed, imagining herself in a pilot's uniform. It felt like a dream, something far away, something for the future. But now, 186 people didn't have a future unless someone did something. Her breath came fast and shallow. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, in her ears, in the center of her chest. She looked around and saw fear on every face. People who had families waiting for them. People who had dreams. People who trusted that the pilots would get them home safely. But the pilots weren't coming back. Not now. Not in time. The flight attendant's voice broke the silence again, this time thinner, more desperate. "Please, someone, anyone." Emily swallowed hard. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear alone. She knew something that no one else knew: she could help. Or at least she could try. She understood the controls, the layout, the systems, at least well enough to keep the aircraft steady until help arrived. She had practiced emergency landings on the simulator hundreds of times. She knew the feeling of holding the virtual yoke, guiding the aircraft through turbulence, adjusting speed, altitude, and pitch. But this wasn't a game. This was real. The consequences were real. If she made a mistake, she wouldn't have a reset button. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, summoning the voice she needed to hear most, the voice of her father saying, "A good pilot never backs away from responsibility." And sometimes, bravery is doing the impossible even when you're terrified. Emily opened her eyes. The plane tilted again, and a woman across the aisle shrieked as her coffee spilled into her lap. A flight attendant stumbled and caught herself on the seatbacks. Somewhere near the front, a baby wailed loudly. Emily stood. She didn't rise slowly or hesitantly. She stood with purpose, even though her legs felt weak beneath her. She stepped into the aisle, her small hands trembling as she held onto the seats for balance. Passengers looked at her in confusion as she walked forward, this tiny girl with big, frightened eyes, moving when no one else dared. A man grabbed her arm gently. "Sweetheart, this isn't safe. Go sit down. Your parents." "My parents aren't here," she said softly. And then, with more courage than anyone expected, she added, "I can help." The man blinked, unsure if he heard her correctly. Surely she didn't mean, no, that would be impossible. But Emily continued forward. The closer she got to the front, the louder the cockpit alarms grew. She could feel the vibration of the engines through the floor. She could feel the wrong tilt of the plane. She could feel the fear of every single person in that cabin, pressing against her like a physical force. The flight attendant at the front turned toward her, confused. "Sweetie, you need to return to your seat. We're in an emergency right now." "I know," Emily said, her voice low but steady. "That's why I'm here. I can fly the plane." The flight attendant froze. She looked at the girl as though she were seeing a ghost. You what?" "I've trained on a flight simulator for years. My dad taught me everything. I think I can take control. At least try to keep it steady until someone guides me." The flight attendant stared at her, stunned into silence. She glanced around desperately, hoping to see some adult step forward and take responsibility, but no one did. The passengers looked just as shocked as she felt. Some shook their heads, others watched with wide, fearful eyes. No one volunteered. Emily stood there, small and determined, her eyes full of urgency and courage. And in that moment, the flight attendant realized the brutal truth: they had no other option. Zero. None. She knelt down, putting herself at eye level with Emily. Her voice wavered. "Are you sure you can do this?" Emily nodded slowly. "If I don't try, no one else will." Something inside the flight attendant cracked. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was both. She rose to her feet, placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, and whispered, "Then come with me." The cockpit door was already open, emergency protocols overriding the usual security lockout. Inside, the sight was far worse than Emily imagined. Both pilots were slumped over their controls, unconscious, their oxygen masks uselessly hanging above them. The instrument panel blinked with red warnings. The sound of altitude alerts, stall warnings, and system failures mixed into a chaotic storm of noise. Emily's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, her courage wavered. The real cockpit looked nothing like the simulator. The buttons were more numerous, the screens brighter, the pressure heavier. The yoke wasn't plastic, it was metal, solid, cold, alive with the trembling of the aircraft. But then she stepped forward. Her small hands gripped the co-pilot's yoke, feeling the vibration of the engines through her fingertips. She remembered her father's lessons. She remembered every emergency simulation she had survived. She remembered the steps: stabilize first, then communicate, then make a plan. Her voice was quiet but steady as she said, "I need to talk to the tower." The flight attendant scrambled to grab the headset, pressing it gently over Emily's ears. Static filled the connection at first, then a voice broke through, confused and urgent. Flight 782, we're receiving emergency codes. Pilot, please respond. Emily swallowed hard. This is Emily. I'm 11 years old. The pilots are unconscious. I'm trying to control the plane. Silence filled the headset for several seconds. Then the air traffic controller spoke again, but this time with a different tone, slow, clear, shock barely hidden beneath the professionalism. Okay, Emily. We're here with you. You're very brave. We're going to help you. First, tell me, can you hold the yoke steady? Emily tightened her grip, her arms trembling from the weight and the responsibility. I'm trying, she whispered. The plane dipped again, but this time she fought it. She pulled gently back, just like she had done hundreds of times at home. The nose lifted. The aircraft steadied. The alarms quieted, just a little. And behind her, the entire cabin held its breath. In that moment, the fate of 186 passengers rested in the hands of an 11-year-old girl who had only ever flown inside a video game, but who refused to let fear win. She entered the cockpit with shaking hands, the weight of the moment pressing down on her tiny shoulders like the force of an entire world. For a heartbeat, she simply stood there, frozen between terror and determination. The cockpit looked nothing like the calm, organized space she remembered from her flight simulator screen. It was chaos, alarms screaming in rhythmic pulses, red warnings flashing across multiple monitors, and the two pilots slumped over their controls, completely unconscious. The smell of overheated electronics mixed with the metallic scent of fear. Everything felt too real. Her footsteps felt loud as she approached the controls. The vibrations of the struggling aircraft traveled up the soles of her shoes and into her bones. She lifted her trembling hand and rested it on the co-pilot's yoke. It quivered violently under her fingers, shuddering with every gust of air outside. Her breath caught. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a simulation. This was a metal giant carrying nearly 200 souls, and it was falling. Emily forced herself to breathe. In, out, in, out. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and imagined her father sitting beside her in their dimly lit computer room, guiding her through stormy landings on the simulator. "You must stay calm," he used to say. "A plane listens better to calm hands than scared ones." She opened her eyes, wiped her palms on her jeans, and wrapped her fingers tightly around the yoke. "Emily," the air traffic controller's voice crackled through the headset, breaking through the roar of alarms. "We're here with you. You're doing great. I need you to try lifting the nose slightly. Just a gentle pull. Gentle." Emily clung to that word like a lifeline. She pulled back slowly, carefully, fighting the instinct to yank too hard. The plane wobbled violently as if resisting her touch. Her arms trembled from the tension. The nose tilted upward, but too much. Alarms blared again, louder this time. "Easy, Emily," the controller's voice said quickly. "Ease forward just a little. You're doing fine." She pushed forward, too gently to make a difference at first. The aircraft dipped again. Her breath hitched. She steadied herself, pushed a little more, found the balance point, and finally felt the resistance of the aircraft settle into something manageable. The wobbles didn't stop entirely, but they softened enough for her to feel like she was not just fighting the plane, but guiding it. Behind her, the cabin was silent. Silent in a way that carried 1,000 emotions: fear, disbelief, hope. Passengers clung to each other. Parents held their children close. Some had tears in their eyes. Others whispered prayers. Every pair of eyes stared forward, even though they could not see her. They felt her presence through the shifting movements of the aircraft, knowing somewhere up front, a child was battling for their lives. Emily's arms ached, her fingers gripping the yoke tighter than she realized. The vibration of the aircraft never stopped, the steady, deep hum of the engines felt like a heartbeat connected directly to her own. She could feel every tremor in the metal frame, every shudder of the wings slicing through unstable air. Sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled down her nose. She blinked it away, refusing to lose focus. "Emily," the controller said again, his voice soft but urgent. "You're stabilizing the aircraft. That's excellent work. How are you holding up?" She didn't even realize she was crying until a tear dripped onto the control panel. I'm trying," she whispered. Her voice cracked like a child who had finally realized the enormity of what she was doing. But she tightened her grip again, refusing to let fear take over. "That's all we need," he said gently. "Just keep trying. That's enough." The plane shook again, like a great beast trying to break free from her control. The altimeter needle wavered dangerously. Emily leaned forward, focusing every ounce of her attention on the horizon outside the cockpit window. The sky tilted in a dizzying diagonal streak of blue and white. She could hear the passengers gasp behind her as the cabin tilted. Someone screamed. A cart clattered somewhere down the aisle. Emily bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. "Please, please work," she whispered to the plane, as though it were a frightened animal. She pulled back slightly on the yoke, coaxing it, begging it, guiding it. The wings leveled, just a little, but enough to stop the sudden dip. The controller's voice returned. "Beautiful, Emily. That's exactly right. Keep your eyes forward. We're going to walk you through everything. I promise you, you're not alone." For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe him. But then a new alarm screamed, a pitch she had not heard before. A deep, harsh warning tone that cut through the cockpit like a razor. She flinched, heart pounding. Red lights flashed on the engine display. "What's happening?" she cried. "Emily," the controller said, voice tense now, "you're getting wind shear. That's a sudden change in wind direction. It's very dangerous, but you're going to stay calm. Just hold the yoke steady. Don't overcorrect. Let the plane ride it out. Ride it out. Ride it out." She repeated the words in her mind like a mantra. The plane shifted violently again, almost knocking her back in her seat. The left wing dipped sharply, and she felt her stomach twist. Another alarm erupted. She leaned her whole body into the yoke, using every ounce of strength she had. Her arms whimpered in pain. Her back tensed. Her fingertips went numb, but she didn't let go. Passengers screamed again. A baby wailed. Someone shouted a prayer. Someone else cried out a name. Emily gritted her teeth and pulled the yoke back to center inch by inch, her breath shallow and ragged. "That's it," the controller's voice urged. "You're doing it. Keep going. You're doing everything right." The wind shear finally eased, the violent shaking reduced to a trembling vibration. Emily exhaled shakily, but she didn't loosen her grip. She didn't trust her hands to stay steady if she relaxed at all. "How am I doing?" she whispered, not sure she wanted the answer. "You're keeping 200 people alive," the controller said, his voice thick with awe. Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with a kind of fierce, burning determination. She wasn't just a child sitting in a cockpit anymore. She was the only line between life and disaster. And though her arms shook, though her voice trembled, though fear clawed at her insides like an animal, she refused to break. She focused again on the horizon. The wobbles grew smaller. The plane steadied. The alarms quieted one by one, though a few remained stubbornly lit. Her breathing slowed. Her muscles relaxed, just slightly. Enough to think. Enough to plan. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could do this. "Emily," the controller said, "you're about to do something extraordinary. You're flying this aircraft. Now we're going to help you prepare for the landing." Her breath caught again. Landing. The word hit her like a punch to the chest. Keeping the plane stable was one thing, but landing. Landing was something even experienced pilots feared in emergencies. But she didn't speak. She didn't protest. She didn't say she was too scared or too small or too unprepared. Instead, she wiped the tears off her cheeks with the back of her hand, tightened her grip on the yoke again, and nodded even though the controller couldn't see her. "Okay," she whispered, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Tell me what to do." Behind her, an entire cabin leaned forward with desperate hope. Mothers held their children. Strangers prayed. People whispered that the plane felt steadier, felt safer. They didn't know how, but they sensed it. There was a hero in the cockpit. With one final adjustment, she lined up with the runway. In that single moment, it felt as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. The sky outside the cockpit was painted in streaks of fading orange and gray, the last light of day reflecting off the shaking wings. The runway stretched ahead like a narrow ribbon of hope, glowing under rows of guiding lights that flickered softly in the growing dusk. Emily's heart pounded so hard she could feel each beat in her throat, her chest, and even her trembling fingertips wrapped around the yoke. Her breaths came in short, shaky bursts, but she never allowed herself to look away from the runway. Her hands were small, barely reaching around the metal controls, yet they held a steadiness that didn't belong to an 11-year-old. Sweat clung to her forehead and streamed down her temples, making her hair stick to her skin. Her arms burned with fatigue. Hours of battling the plane had drained almost every ounce of strength from her. But she kept going, because stopping wasn't an option, not now, not when the finish line was finally in sight. The controller's calm voice echoed through her headset. "Steady, Emily. You're perfectly aligned. Maintain your glide. You're doing beautifully." She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm trying." "You're not trying," he said softly. "You're doing it." The confidence in his voice steadied her more than the controls ever could. She forced herself to focus on the angle of descent, the speed indicators, the flashing warnings that still glowed like angry red eyes from the dashboard. The plane was heavy, heavier than any simulation she had practiced on, and every adjustment she made felt like fighting the weight of the world. The engines roared loudly, vibrating through the cockpit like a living heartbeat. The wheels were still tucked beneath the aircraft, waiting for her command. "Lower the landing gear," the controller instructed. Emily reached for the lever with shaking fingers. She hesitated. One mistake could send the plane spiraling. She closed her eyes for half a second, hearing her father's voice in her memory, "Trust yourself. Trust your hands." She pulled the lever down. A mechanical groan echoed through the frame of the aircraft. The landing gear deployed, locking into place beneath them. The cabin behind her erupted with gasps and whispers, some hopeful, some terrified, but Emily couldn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the runway. "You're doing perfectly," the controller continued. "Now maintain your descent. Keep the nose level. You're almost there. Almost there." Two words that felt heavier than anything she had carried in her life. She nudged the yoke downward just slightly, just enough to guide the airplane toward the runway lights. The ground came closer. The details sharpened. She could see emergency vehicles lined along the edges, fire trucks, ambulances, airport staff all standing still, holding their breath, watching the sky for the miracle they prayed would happen. Inside the cabin, complete silence consumed the passengers. Mothers held children so tightly their knuckles turned white. Strangers clasped hands despite never meeting before. An elderly man whispered words of faith under his breath. A teenage girl hugged her little brother with shaking arms. And through all of it, a shared hope pulsed through the aircraft, a belief in the tiny girl up front who was fighting a war between life and death with nothing more than courage and instinct. "Careful now," the controller whispered. "Ease back, not too much, just a little." Emily slowly pulled the yoke toward her, controlling the descent as the runway rushed up to meet them. The wheels were seconds away from touching the earth. Her entire body tightened in anticipation. Her stomach twisted. Her vision blurred from tears she couldn't wipe away. The first wheel hit the ground. The impact jolted through the plane like a thunderbolt. The nose lurched forward. For a terrifying moment, Emily lost her grip on the right side of the yoke as her hand slipped from sweat and vibration. The plane skidded, swaying sharply. Everyone screamed. Luggage toppled from overhead bins. A drink cart smashed into a row of seats. Emily grabbed the yoke again with both hands, her fingers locking around it with desperate determination. She pulled, fighting the skid, forcing the aircraft to straighten. Sparks erupted beneath the plane, bright orange trails streaking behind them as the metal scraped against the runway. The plane shook so violently she thought it would tear apart. But she held on. "Brake. Brake now," the controller ordered. She slammed her foot down on the rudder pedals, her small legs barely able to push with enough force. The brakes engaged, shrieking loud enough to pierce the roar of the engines. The jet skidded, fishtail-ed, and dragged itself forward with a violent, trembling crawl. For a moment, it felt endless, like the runway stretched on forever, like they were trapped in a nightmare loop of noise, sparks, and panic. Then, slowly, gradually, the plane's speed began to fall. The roar softened. The shaking eased. The sparks faded. The jet rolled forward one last foot, then stopped. Silence. Utter, complete, overwhelming silence. The plane sat motionless on the runway, smoke curling gently from the brakes. Inside the cabin, not a single person moved. The quiet was so deep it felt almost sacred. Emily sat frozen, her hands still gripping the yoke so tightly her knuckles had turned ghost white. Her chest heaved with exhausted breaths. Tears streamed down her cheeks, unstoppable, unstoppable, unstoppable. Then, somewhere behind her, someone gasped. Another person let out a broken laugh. And then, cheers. Loud, raw, unrestrained cheers exploded through the aircraft. People stood from their seats despite shaking legs. Some screamed in joy. Some sobbed uncontrollably. Some hugged the nearest stranger. Flight attendants covered their mouths with trembling hands, tears flowing freely as the realization hit them, they were alive. All of them. Every single one. Emily slumped back in the co-pilot's seat, her entire body shaking. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She was simply breathing, as though each breath was a miracle in itself. The controller's voice came through the headset one last time, soft and full of awe. Emily, you did it. You brought them home. The cockpit door slowly opened as the lead flight attendant stepped inside, her eyes red from crying. She didn't say a word. She simply knelt in front of Emily and wrapped her arms around the trembling girl, holding her tightly as she sobbed into her shoulder. Passengers gathered behind them, waiting their turn to see the brave child who had saved their lives. Some cried. Some whispered thank you. Some couldn't speak at all. In their eyes, she wasn't just an 11-year-old girl. She was a hero, a real hero, forged not from strength or experience, but from heart, courage, and the unshakable belief that she had to try. On that runway, under the fading evening sky, Emily became something more than anyone expected. She became the miracle hundreds of people would never forget.